Now, we've seen so far that figuring out if an argument is sound, if an argument is good or not, involves two things. It involves looking at the logic of the argument, the inference, and looking at the facts. Now, what we'd like to do is simplify being able to evaluate the argument so that if we can find a simple way of understanding the logic or seeing whether or not the logic is good or bad, whether the inference is good or bad, will make our jobs a lot easier. And if we can use this in reconstructing the arguments, it's going to eliminate half the job. We're just going to have to think about whether the premises are factually correct. And there is a method to do this. In order to implement, to use this method, we have to understand that about 90% of the inferences that are made, the logic, is determined just by a couple of logical words, a couple of what called in symbolic logic classes or math classes sometimes operators. And the words are pretty common. We've seen them. In the last argument, we saw one of them, all. Many arguments, the logic of many arguments, I should say, turn on the word all. And another one is if then. And I think between all and if then, we're going to get a reasonably large percentage of the arguments covered that we'll be encountering certainly in the course of the semester. And the nice thing is that we're going to find that inferences using all and if then run parallel in a certain way. And that is that for each of them, there are really three different patterns of good inference. The idea being if the argument does not follow one of these good patterns of argument, we can assume it's wrong. So notice it's going to make it a lot easier for us to determine if an argument's valid. And furthermore, when we're reconstructing an argument, I think the first thing we're going to want to do is try to make it a valid argument. And if we make it follow one of these good patterns of inference, we're not going to have to worry about whether the logic is good or bad. We're going to know that the logic is good. And just so you understand what we're going to call these, going forward, there are three patterns of inference for all, three for if then, and you're going to see parallels. So really, if you can remember three, you're really going to remember six inferences that are going to account for just about everything you need to know with regard to validity, valid inferences in our course. And we're going to call the first one, we'll call a direct inference. The second one we'll call indirect inference. And the last one we're going to call a chain inference, and you'll see why. But I just wanted to give you this introduction because once we start jumping into the details, it can begin to look really complicated. But when you realize that we're only talking about three patterns of inference and variations between all and if then, and the variations work in the same way, it makes it really simple so we can learn three patterns of inference, based on that know six patterns of inference, and be able to reconstruct valid arguments, which will, for the most part, get us through a good part of this course.